In today's video, I'm going to show you 30 essential watercolor techniques that I wish someone had taught me when I was a beginner artist. I'm going to start from the most basic ones, and then we're going to move on to more advanced and more fun and expressive ones. So without any further ado, let's get into the painting. The first technique is wet on dry. You probably heard of this technique. It's the most basic one, and you just simply wet your brush, get some paint, and paint on a dry surface. What you want to remember when you're using this technique is you want to have enough water on your brush so that you can easily glide your brush and paint the whole section that you need to paint. And also, I wanted to tell you a secret about this technique. You get the most fresh look out of your watercolor paintings when you use this technique. For some reason, the colors look better when you use them wet on dry compared to the other techniques such as wet on wet, or when you charge and add more color into a existing wet wash. I'm going to show you in just a second. The next technique is wet on wet. So for this technique, I'm going to simply wet my paper, and then I'm going to take the excess water of my brush and add some thicker paint so that I can have better control on my paint. Just simply add in more color. This technique is so satisfying to watch, just seeing the colors move on the paper. Another way that you can use this technique is to wet your paper using a very watered down wash, very watered down yellow. And then you take the excess water of your brush and add another color wet on wet. When you're using this technique, it's all about how much water you have on your brush. If you want to have the most control, you want to have the least amount of water on your brush. So when you apply the paint, the colors sit where you put them. For example, right now, I barely have any water on my brush. And I'm going to add this color, this blue color. And as you can see, even though the paper is wet, this color doesn't spread as much as the red one did because I don't have that much water on my brush. The next technique is one of my favorite watercolor techniques that I use in every single painting, and that's softening the edges. So you basically use a color and paint a shape, for example, mountain shape. And then you clean your brush. You take the excess water off your brush and you soften the edges. And this way you have some harder edges at the top section of the mountains and some softer edges at the bottom. A very important tip that I want to mention here is that every paper holds a different amount of water. For example, this paper is orange and it's a very thirsty paper. It needs more water. So when I'm softening the edges, for example, for this mountain, I need to have, my brush shouldn't be too dry. It should have a relatively good amount of water still on it to be able to glide it on top of the surface of the paper. But some other papers like Sunders or some other brands, they don't require that much water as Arch does. So you want to practice with your paper first so you know how much water you need to have on your brush. The next technique is a more professional technique, but it can be very useful, especially for landscape paintings. So you basically paint a shape wet on dry. And then you clean your brush. You take the excess water off your brush and you move on to a different color and you paint that color right next to the other one while the other one is still wet. This way you get soft edges at the edges of those two colors when they meet. A very important tip that you need to remember is to definitely take the excess water off your brush, because if you go back in with a lot of water on your brush and paint this green shape, it can run into the other shape and create a really nasty background or cauliflower shape over here. The next technique is also a more advanced technique, and that's glazing. So you basically paint, for example, a landscape painting, a very simple sky and a simple land. And you allow these colors to dry completely. I'm going to use my hairdryer to dry the painting real quick. And then I'm going to clean my brush and take some very watered down paint. I don't want to have a very thick and concentrated paint. And then I paint another layer on top of the existing layer. You can use this to create texture effects or just strengthen the color that is already on the paper. If you see your colors may look too weak or pale, you can paint another glazing layer like this to strengthen that color and make it look more vibrant. And I can also soften the edges over here too. So obviously you can mix and combine any of these techniques together in a painting. And the next technique is a graded wash. So for this technique, this is very useful, especially for painting skies in a landscape. So you want to have a good amount of paint on your brush. And then at this stage, you clean your brush, and instead of taking more paint out of your palette, you take the excess water off your brush and you paint a little bit more. And this way you have like a soft transition between that darker color at top and the lighter one at the bottom. This is very useful for painting skies because usually the tonal value of the sky is much darker at top and it goes lighter as it goes towards the horizon. So this is a very simple way that you can practice this technique. So the next technique is charging. This is also one of my favorite watercolor techniques. It's so satisfying to watch. So you basically want to have a wet wash. You can either wet your paper first or just paint it wet on dry. And then you just drop new colors into the existing wet wash. You can see that this color is spreading and having really nice soft edge, and it's just so relaxing to see these colors blend. And sometimes the colors can change, so this blue color can mix with the existing color that was already in the paper, and they can create really nice beautiful new colors that can be really surprising sometimes. So this is really interesting, just fascinating how watercolor can behave on the paper. You might think that this technique might be very similar to wet on wet. The only difference that this technique has with wet on wet is that wet on wet you can just wet the paper with clean water and then add the color, but with charging technique you already have color pigment on the paper and then you add different colors on top of it. Some artists like to mix their colors on the paper like this instead of mixing it on their palette, and the color separation can add really interesting textures and patterns on the painting. And the next technique is something that I usually use a lot. So you basically paint a shape in your painting. Doesn't have to be two different colors, can be anything you want. And then you allow this color to semi-dry. And then you're going to clean your brush. Make sure it doesn't have too much water. Maybe dab it a little bit on a paper towel. And then use your finger and try to splatter some clean water on top of the surface of the paper. You can see that these tiny blooms are starting to form, and it can add interest to your paintings and create a more beautiful surface. The next technique is something very important because you can fix your mistakes and lift the paint that is already on the paper. For example, I'm going to paint a sky shape, and then I'm going to clean my brush, take the excess water, and then I'm going to try and lift some paint for clouds in the sky. Notice that I'm cleaning my brush every single time I'm touching the paper to make sure that I'm not muddying up my colors. And you can really get creative when you use this technique. For example, you can paint like a nighttime sky shape. And then I'm going to move on to a smaller brush. My brush, take the excess water, and just imagine there's like a cabin or a house over here, and there's smoke coming out of that the chimney of the cabin. So I'm going to use my clean damp brush to lift some shape for the smoke coming out of the house. Sometimes it works better when you completely take the excess water off your brush and squeeze it in a paper towel like that. And the next technique is very similar to the last one, but this time we're going to lift paint from a dry paper. So I'm going to mix some indigo and cerulean blue, and maybe a simple grass shape. So just imagine this is like a nighttime sky and some grasses. I'm going to use my hairdryer to dry the painting. And then I'm going to use a Q-tip. I'm going to dab it into clean water. And then I'm going to massage the paper. And try to lift paint for like a moon effect. And you can also use your brushes to lift paint. And the more stiff your brush, the easier it is to do this technique. So you can, for example, have like an acrylic or mixed media brush and just use that one for when you want to lift paint. You can use it for everything, like lifting ripples on top of the water, lifting some highlights on a tree trunk, or anything that you can think of. Something very important to remember when you want to lift paint is the quality of the pigment that you used to paint that area. For example, some watercolor paints are very staining, so they're very hard to lift once they're completely dry, especially some watercolor brands like Sennelier or M. Graham that use honey as their binder. Because of the honey, the colors really stick to the paper and it's really hard to remove. And also some other brands that don't use honey use ordinary gum arabic for their binder, but they can be very staining too. So you want to do a research on your colors before you buy them if that's something that you usually use in your painting to make sure that your colors are not too stainy, because if there are, you can still lift the paint, but the paint doesn't really lift as good, and the result can look really muddy and dirty somehow. So that's just something to remember. The next technique is also a lifting technique. I'm going to paint a flat wash of quinacridone magenta. And then I'm going to use a magic eraser to lift the paint. This can be very similar to using a brush or a Q-tip or any tool that you can use to lift the paint, but this is more powerful. So it lifts more aggressively compared to those other tools. You can see that you can really try and lift paint. And you can also repeat the same process, let this dry, and then repeat it multiple times to remove the paint completely off the paper. The next technique is one of my favorite ones as well, is lifting paint using a paper towel. I painted a simple blue wash that could be like a blue sky, and then I'm going to use a paper towel. I'm going to try and have it in like an irregular shape like this, and then I'm dabbing on the color and trying to, if it's not already too dry, I'm going to try and lift some cloud shapes. And this is a very useful technique as well. You can even use it to create texture effects on the paper. So not only you can try and lift the paint completely, but you can also try and really lightly dab it on the paper, and you can create some subtle texture effects on your paper. For example, if you're painting some mountains in the distance, you can create some really subtle textures by just slightly, really lightly dabbing on the paint with your paper towel. And also, for example, if you're painting a mountain in the distance and you feel like the color could be too dark, before the paint dries, you can dab it with a paper towel, and that way you can lift the paint without risking creating a muddy effect for that area. So many variety of each one of these techniques that you can use for your paintings. The next technique is also a very useful technique. I'm going to paint a small blue shape that can be surface of the water, and I'm going to use my hairdryer to dry this completely. And once the paint is completely dry, we can use a razor to lift some paint. This is permanently damaging your paper, so you need to make sure the exact place that you want to paint those ripples, and also the texture of the paper that you use can affect the kind of patterns that can be created by the razor. So this is a rough surface watercolor paper, and it's very heavily textured, so these are kind of like large and rough looking. But if you're using like a finer like a cold press paper or hot press, these textures and patterns can be much smaller. The next technique is creating texture effects using salt. So I'm going to paint a big shape of lavender here, maybe a little bit of blue. And then I'm going to have some indigo at the bottom. The way I like to use this technique is to use a mixture of larger grain sea salt and some finer ordinary table salt. I like to mix these together so I get the combination of some larger patterns and some smaller ones. And once the paper is not too wet, we're going to sprinkle some of this salt. And something very important to remember is that different pigments can create different kind of a texture effects using salt. So as always, please practice it on a piece of paper so you know the kind of textures will be created by salt. Indigo, for example, is a color that textures can be really harsh and pronounced when you use salt on it. So I usually don't like to use it unless it's like very suitable for the painting. But some other colors like cerulean blue, the textures can be more subtle. Also, when you sprinkle salt on the lighter parts of the painting, for example, over here, it's lighter, it doesn't have as much pigment. The effects can look much more subtle and beautiful in my opinion. And if you sprinkle it on the darker sections, the effects can look really harsh and they have to be very suitable for the effects that you want to achieve for your painting. Otherwise, they're not going to look good in your painting. The next technique is also a more expressive and fun watercolor technique, and that's using a plastic wrap to create texture effects on a wet surface. So I'm going to have my plastic wraps ready here, and you can also try and make some patterns with your plastic wrap. If you want to create like a effect of waves on the water, you can try to stretch it like this. So as you can see, it's very subtle. You'll see better on the paper, but you see that this is more similar to the shapes of ripples or whatever that can be on the water, like waves. Or you can really scrunch it and create some textures that can be more suitable for like a for patterns that you want to create on a rock or completely different than having these. I'm going to show you on the paper. So you want your colors to be very wet. So make sure you have a lot of water, because if the colors are not too wet, they're not going to create as much of a texture as you might hope for. So I'm going to have a little bit of burnt sienna at the bottom over here, with a little bit of indigo in it. And I'm going to use this first one on the blue and like stretch it like this. And I'm going to put like a really lightweight object. This one might be even too heavy. Something very lightweight. This one is too wet. I'm going to try and take the excess water off of it a little bit. And then I'm going to use the other one in a more abstract shape. And you need to let these air dry. You don't want to use hair dryer because the effect might look a little bit different. And like I said, you can combine these techniques together. If you're painting, if you want to create texture effects on a rock, you can sprinkle a little bit of table salt first and then put the plastic wrap on it, so you can have the combination of both textures that can look really interesting in a rock.